Have you ever found yourself passing data from your controller to your service to another service, finally down to the model layer to get something out of the database? Well, in this video, I'm going to show you how to use async local storage and decorators to make that process a lot cleaner and happier. Also, what do you think about this background? All right, so first things first, we are obviously going to use ChatGPT. One thing I'm interested in is there's a lot of frameworks that can handle this for you, but a lot of folks out there still use Express. So, hi ChatGPT. Let's see, how many Node.js projects are using the Express.js framework? And it doesn't like this because everybody's using ChatGPT. Guys, get off ChatGPT. I'm trying to use it. All right, well, we'll come back to that later. Let's go over here. Let's set up our project. So we're going to set up a project. We're going to call it ALS Decor, I guess. Oh, something's happening. How are you today? And we'll cd into that because we're going to use this async local storage. Node.js's native async local storage and decorators to accomplish some fun things. And we're going to do our typical np. Go ahead and fire up VS Code here. Just go ahead and like full screen this just for a second. We're going to do our normal project setup. I'm going to install TypeScript and all that good stuff. Feel free to skip ahead. npm install ts node. I don't need TypeScript because that comes with TS node. Types node, of course. And of course, node mon. Get our index TS going. Oh, I didn't do the npm init. My bad. Let's go check on ChatGPT here. How many? ChatGPT. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do here is we're going to create our pretend controller service model layer, right? So we're just going to do touch controller, and then service TS, model TS. And we're going to go ahead and implement all these, and it's going to look something like, you know what, I want to move this all into a source directory because I'm kind of crazy like that. Oops. Make dir source, move star.ts into source, of course, which I think also means I need to go change this to source. All right, finally set up. So we got our files here, controller model service, and the way that we want to use this is I actually want to say, you know, import controller from the controller. Wow, it just does not do the thing. And then the way I want to use this is I want to say const controller gets new controller and controller dot find all. We're just going to implement a simple find all method here. And the basic data structure is going to be users and projects. So we're going to say controller dot find all projects for this user. So we're going to pass in a pretend request object. Okay. So const request, this is mock data. On the request, there is going to be a user ID. User ID of 1, of course. So this request data will get passed in. We'll get the results here. Call this response, actually. And then we'll just console log that out. This is our simple scenario. And the problem is this, if you're trying to get all this, the projects for that user, you have to pass that through all of your layers. Or do you? Fix that there. All right, so let's just go implement this controller setup real quick. And we're actually going to go bottom up so we can kind of be thinking about the data. All right, so in our model file here, we're just going to start real simple. Export a class, call this user model, and we'll set up some mock data, right? DB data equals, we'll put 2 users and 2 projects in here. So user ID 1, let's say your project name is Gemini. And we'll do another one, user ID 2, project name is definitely not Gemini. Got some mock data set up, and then we're gonna just do a simple find all based on the user ID, right? But we don't want to pass the user ID down. So we're just going to leave this a little bit blank for now. And we're just going to return DB data. And it doesn't like that because I did not say this, DB data, of course. Actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and do, we'll go ahead and pass this in kind of the way we want it to work. So we're going to have to pass in some user ID. So find all kind of for this user ID is probably a better name for this. I'm not going to worry about that right now. This will be a number, of course. And I'm going to say filter based on the user ID, right? So record, return the records where record dot user ID equals the passed in user ID. So this is find all by user ID. All right, so the service method, this is really only here to demonstrate the layers that we're going to circumvent with our async local storage. And we will basically do the same thing in the controller class. All right, so we've got our model, our service, our controller set up, and this should work as is. So if we come down here and go ahead and run npx node mon, our index.js should basically instantiate the controller and run through the logic. It does not because it cannot find it because I never imported it properly, of course. And in fact, just do this user controller. It doesn't like request. That's a good call. I'm just passing in a number here and that is not correct. So we're going to pass in a request object, which for now I'm just going to say any because I don't want to deal with the types. And here, this is going to be request dot user ID. Let's see if that gets it working. Okay, there we go. So we get only the one user with project name Gemini, which is good because our filter logic is working correctly. But again, we got a prop drill in order to get all this working. That's not cool. Let's see how decorators and the async local storage can help us out. All right, so to create our decorator, go ahead and create a new file. We're going to call it user data.decorator ts, and we're going to export a new function. Export a function calling this, I don't know, enable user data or something. Yep, that was correct. I'm missing the function call, obviously. Let's go back to the controller, because essentially what we want to do is we want to decorate an aspect of this controller. And you can use decorators at the class level, you can use them at the property level, and you can use them at the method level. And I think there's even a fourth level. I can't remember offhand. And so what we want to do is we want to come in here and say, look, anytime we run this find all method, we want to enable user data. So you define the decorator like so, at enable user data, which is just a function. And because this is on a method property of this class, it's going to have certain parameters, certain arguments that go into that decorator. So if we go back and it's complaining, I don't know why it's complaining right now, too few arguments to be used as a decorator here. Cool, thanks TypeScript. That's actually pretty helpful. So if we come back here, it knows, TypeScript knows that we want this to be some kind of decorator. Again, because it's a method property here, there's going to be 3 arguments that get passed in. The first one is going to be the target, which is the parent object that this method is inside of, right? Typical target stuff. We don't really care what this is. We're not actually going to use it. Oh, any width t, whatever that is. Second thing is, do you guys ever do that? My VS Code auto completes all the time to things that I did not want it to do. Second argument is going to be the property key. All right, this is like the property name of the property being accessed, probably a string, symbol, whatever. Again, I don't really care what the name is in this case, so we're just going to ignore it. The third argument is really the one that we're going to use. It's the descriptor, which is another word for the handle, like the metadata about the method that we're calling. So the descriptor is actually going to be of type property descriptor. Okay. And what that's going to allow us to do typing that is we actually see we've got a couple different things here. We've got the get and set method that we can maybe do some things with. We've got the value, all this sorts of stuff. So if I just maybe take the value here, let's just console log this out and see what this is looking like. Console log the value. Does this even work? Let's go back. I feel like I'm still missing something. Find all. Experimental decorators. Okay, so it doesn't like the fact that we're using the decorators, so we have to update our TS or JS config. You know, there used to be a way where I could quickly resolve this. You know why? Okay, check this out. So I don't have the TypeScript config set up over here. So if I do a new window here, and I just say npx tsc, what is it, init, I believe. That just tells the project, yes, I'm doing TypeScript, I know what I'm doing. And now if I hover over this little squiggly, it says I have a quick fix option, enable experimental decorators, and boom, thank you VS Code. There we go. Okay, so it knows, look at this, it's printing out the function find all. This is coming from our decorator right here. And it seems to be working just fine without any changes that I've made so far. You just made your first decorator that does nothing. Congratulations. All right, so let's make it do something, right? So what we're actually going to do is, the way this is going to work is it's going to be a method interceptor. Okay, so when somebody calls this method, like our framework, if we're using a framework, or in this case, we're kind of hard coding it and just calling it here. When this method is called, we want to do something to the context first. We want to handle this request first, intercept it, and then call the find all method. And the way that we're going to do that is back in our decorator. The first thing is we're going to save the original method. All right. Maybe I'll call this original function to be a little more JavaScript-y. And that will be the descriptor value. We're going to add in our own little interceptor. We're going to say the descriptor.value is now a new function that does whatever it does. So it'll take in the arguments, it'll handle those a little bit. And let's just go ahead and make another console log statement. I have been intercepted. And then we're going to call the original function. We're going to say original function dot, what is it? I think we just do dot call, honestly, for now. We're gonna change that a little bit later, but for now we just say dot call. We're going to say this. You have to have the this. You don't want to lose the this context. And in fact, because we're using this, we're going to make sure to do this as a function, not an anonymous function here. So we're going to call this with the arguments, of course. All right. Now it doesn't like my arguments, probably because it's not typed. I don't really care what the types are. A little better. And so this should work as is. It does not. Okay. What did I do wrong here? Oh, it does say I've been intercepted, but it did not return the values that I was looking for. That is probably because I did not put the return in here. We ran the method, we just didn't return the data. All right, good to go here. So the next little thing we're going to do is we're actually going to pull off the user ID value from the request object. Because when this is getting called, we actually have access, right? We have the arguments right here. We know what these arguments are going to be. And so I can say that first argument request is args sub 0. And on that request, I should have, let's just pop it in here, request dot user ID. And we haven't had this typed yet. Obviously, I should probably type this to call it request object, put on some of this data that's going to be there. For now, I'm not going to worry about that. And here we go. We have the user ID being printed out here. You have been intercepted, or I have been intercepted. You, I, we. So this is super cool. We have our data, but now the trick is I want to save off this user ID, as it were. Think about this as almost like a Redis cache or something. It's like you can save it off, this value, and then you can come back to it later in your code. And that's where the async local storage is going to come into play. So let's go create that file and that functionality. All right, so with the async local storage, the way that we're going to do this, we're going to do this as simply as possible. I would recommend a little bit more abstraction and generalization when you put this in your real application. But for now, we're just going to call this very simple app context. .ts. And what this is going to do is this is going to export const. We're just going to call it ALS for now. Yeah, we can call it app context actually. And then we're do this as new local async local storage. Okay. And that is from async hooks. And since I do want to type the objects going in and out of my store, we're going to go ahead and set up those types. I don't really want to set up those types. Export type, we're just going to call this ALS data. Again, I'm changing my mind. I want to call everything app context because that's what we're doing. We're setting up a global app context. What you should do is try to bound that by, you know, a request context or something like that at the very least. Maybe even a user request context, and use different stores to manage different parts of your app. So this is going to be user data, and inside of that user data, it should have a user ID, which can be any number. Whoops. So we'll name namespace this a little bit in case we want, you know, user data as opposed to project data, whatever's being put in the context. All right, so that is our app context. Let's go ahead and use this now in our decorator. We're going to set up a new context in the decorator so that we can access it later in the model. So if we head back to the decorator here, we're already getting the request user ID, or the user ID off the request here. So this is where things get pretty fun. So you're going to say, get the ALS, where's that? Or no, what do we call it? We called it app context. Get app context from app context. And we're going to say run. And this is going to take in the store that you're going to set up in the context, the store of data. And then the second argument here is the callback, which is the function that you're going to want to run. It's kind of like the next function in Express. And so we're going to go ahead and say, okay, well, this is, oh, you know what? I forgot something. Hold on. Before we do this, we want some type helpers here. This should be getting mad at us. If I just come in here and say anything like name Dan, it doesn't, well, it gets mad because I don't have a function call in here right now. But it should know that there's a limited number of values we're doing here. We want some TypeScript help. So we're going to go back to our app context, and we're going to make sure that when we set up this async local storage, it is in fact of type app context. Now when I do this, I go back to the decorator and it says, nope, you can't do that. Sorry. You're only allowed to have whatever app name doesn't exist, right? So when I come back here, it says, it helps me out. It says, hey, you should have some user data. You should have user ID, if anything, and that's going to be the request user ID, of course. Something like this. Okay, we're getting better. We have this callback here though, and we want to make sure that this callback is actually the original function we were going to call. It's this guy here. And so the way that we're going to do that is instead of adding in this function, we are going to say, call the original function, but we want to bind this to this context and make sure that it does in fact call the args. We don't want to just straight up call it. Okay, if we called it, we would jump into that method before we're ready. We just want to bind this method so that after async local storage is done setting up the context, it will then invoke this function. So if we do this, I'm going to head and just keep this simple right now, not add any error checking or anything. And it's failing. Perfect. Okay, I think the reason this isn't working is I think we need to add a return right here, because this is the same problem we had before earlier. I would invoke the function, but I wasn't returning any of its data. Okay, and that works. So that's one cool thing about the async local storage is when you set these up, when you call this run function, it's still going to run through and grab the results and push those back to you on the call stack, which in other use cases is critically important. Okay, so we're looking pretty good here. I'm going to take out this console log just to keep my console a little bit cleaner. And the next thing we're going to do, now we have this data in our async local storage, we want to pull it back out somewhere else in the code base and be able to use it. All right, so let's head to our model. We're going to hop over to the model here. And right now we're getting this user ID as an argument, but we can go ahead and change that. So again, if I go over and get my app context, I've got a couple of methods here, and I have a get store method. And again, since I set up the app context with the type, it shows me exactly what I want to see. It should have a user data. Whoops. Oh boy, can't find my fingers. It should have a user ID. Of course, async local storage says, well, you might not have set this up correctly. You have to make sure that that decorator is on that particular controller handler. So this might not exist. That's why it's not making any guarantees about this data here. We know it does. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. I should have the user ID straight from here, so I can update my code and get rid of this here. And does it still work? Do I still get user ID 1? It does not, because now I broke my my type helpers here. So in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this back in. I'm just going to rename it. So all my code stays the same. I'm just ignoring that parameter now, and it works. So in our controller, we decorated this particular request to find all. It made sure that we have that user ID data in our async local storage. Service doesn't know, the model doesn't use that data. Everything still works. In fact, let's go ahead and clean everything up just to prove that there's no, I didn't make a typo somewhere. Things didn't drift through. If I just remove all these references to this user ID being drilled down in there, bada boom, bada bing, request isn't even used. Everything still works just as we want. Okay, but now a warning. Okay, if I come in here, since the async local storage is only set up with this decorator, so if I come through here and I say find by user or some other weird variation, and this is trying to do the same thing, that's all it's going to do. It's going to make the same exact call down to the user service. It's going to say find by user. If I do this and go back to, I guess, index TS, say find by user. Well, first of all, user doesn't take a request, so I can remove that. I mean, it does, but I didn't put that in. And now it's finding nothing, because that way down in my model now, there is no user ID. This is undefined. So it's returning all the records with user ID of undefined, and so it's just returning nothing. So this is something to be very, very cautious of, and that's why I recommend that if you are going to use async local storage for something like this, you have some pretty good try catches set up. You make sure that you're handling those errors, bubbling them up very clearly, or just have really good kind of fallback logic, right? If user ID does not exist, right? If not user ID, oops, get my order right there, then just return this .db data. This kind of helps you get around that a little bit. It just depends on your use case, right? Because now I'm returning everything. I've changed the behavior of the application. So I'd pursued this use case because I was kind of curious if we could optimize database queries by pulling data off the request and not passing it through 5 layers of controllers, services, models, whatever else. And that's one use case. I think the other really great use case is especially for loggers. If you've got a logger that's coming off the request and you want to reuse that logger everywhere in your code. I've used it for correlation IDs. There's a whole lot of use cases for this kind of thing. And in fact, if you have more ideas, more things that you want to see, leave those in the comments and I'll try to get to them as soon as I can. Oh, it looks like ChatGPT finally got back to us with nothing useful. And one final thing to note, if you're using a framework like Nest.js, this is maybe not the way that you should do it. I think this works great when you have a, somewhat legacy existing Express application and you need to throw some stuff in here. And in fact, some of this stuff should be done in middleware instead of decorators necessarily. But a framework like Nest.js, what you're actually going to want to use is the interceptors, which is exactly just another word for the middleware concept, right? As soon as that thing comes in, on every single request, you might want to do this. The decorators work great when it's not every single request, okay? So if it's every single request on your application, probably something like user ID, use middleware for that. If it's just a specific couple of things on specific methods, that's where you might want to use the decorator approach. And I did think about if we can use the decorator approach on the class level, right? Because I thought, well, what if you wanted to enable user data for every method in this controller? That gets a bit tricky though. And I'm also not sure exactly what the use case would be if you wanted to do that. So I think that just depends on your needs. Might be fun to explore though. All right. Well, thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you found it valuable. Like I said, leave comments if you have questions or things that you want to explore more. You're allowed to down thumb me only if you give me good feedback. Otherwise, up thumb or something. Thanks.